Hello, I'm Haslinda. Amin in Singapore. Southeast Asia is one of the regions most at risk of global warming. Long coastlines, low-lying land, making it vulnerable to rising sea levels. ASEAN's fight against climate change and how it positions for the energy transition will be critical. Governments are raising their long-term climate ambitions. Power plants are being revised to accelerate renewables. International financing support is starting to materialize. But at the same time, the consumption of coal is set to rise as the region continues to grow. The challenges are massive. Joining us for this episode of New Directions, Horace Luke, CEO of Gogoro, which specializes in electric two-wheelers, Eric Francia, President and CEO of ASEAN, one of Southeast Asia's leading renewable companies, and Idris Bowie, Associate Director, Enterprise Risk Management ESG at Espring Investments. Eric, Idris, Horace, thank you for joining us. We know that the world is on the cusp of an energy crisis, and ASEAN plays a huge role in how that issue will play out. It is the fourth largest consumer of energy, and over the last 20 years, it's doubled its size, it's tripled its energy consumption, production, and yet when it comes to renewables, it's still a very small portion, 14%. Idris, put that in perspective for us.
I would start by perhaps sharing a bit more about the kind of investor that Espring Investments is. We're an Asian asset manager. We manage more than $220 billion worth of assets with onshore investment teams in Asia, 5 in ASEAN, where we invest locally. So for Espring Investments, we really see ourselves as asset managers, experts in Asia, with a collective net zero target by 2050. ASEAN is a 10-member state. It has 1 developed market, 4 emerging markets, 1 on the frontier, and another 4 which are not covered by the indexes. Coal-fired power plants is actually a very business-as-usual, very plausible scenario for ASEAN. And I think one of the key things is really to finance the early retirement of coal-fired power plants and bring up the clean power sector, and that's how we can proceed with our energy transition in ASEAN.
Eric, a lot of the ASEAN nations have committed to net zero by 2050, but not the Philippines. Yet, as a company, ASEAN is looking at renewables by 2025. Give us a sense of the thinking for you.
So we started in the Philippines, focused on coal-fired power plants. This was way back in 2011. While Ayala has always stood at the forefront of sustainability, we realized back then that renewables was not going to move the needle or scale up. It was simply too expensive and not reliable at the time. So the first 5 years was really focused on building coal plants, and as I said, we're a microcosm of what happened in Southeast Asia back then. If you look at Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, collectively we've built 45 gigawatts, that's 45,000 megawatts of coal-fired power plants in the last decade or so. But in 2015, 2016, we saw the tide turning on the ESG orientation. So at the time, we decided to divest all of our coal plants in a phased manner and reinvest all the capital that we would raise into renewable energy. Now we're one of the largest players in Southeast Asia with 4,000 megawatts of renewables in 5 different markets, including Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam.
Big ambitions for Gogoro as well. Born in Taiwan, but with a growing footprint in Southeast Asia, it's about electrifying the two-wheelers. When you do your business and in your conversations with governments here, what's the sense you're getting about the commitment to perhaps renewables?
What's interesting about us is that instead of starting from the left, which is kind of what Eric is doing, with the whole generation side of sustainable energy, we really focus on the demand side, all right? Having the consumer, having businesses, having governments really see the value of using sustainable transportation as a mean to kind of get the whole population understanding how electrification and sustainable new transportation can really help cities of tomorrow. So, for example, in Taiwan, when we first started, it was really less than 1% of the vehicles that were sold was electric. Today, after about 7 years, in Taipei, we're about 20%. market share when comparing to the ICE traditional gas vehicle. So making a pretty quick, conversion because we built something that was desirable for the consumer. When our customers are not swapping batteries for their vehicle, we're actually pushing those energy back to the grid and helping stabilize the frequency of the grid. There is that aha moment that says, not only are we creating this supply, but actually there's a real world application where the public is going to actually celebrate renewable energy.
The thing is, Idris, there could be that aha moment, as Horace says, but demand is still not there. It's still lackluster in Southeast Asia. I mean, Eric may be looking at going fully renewables by 2025, but where is demand?
It really comes to price point. And price point really looks at the cost of how the renewables are being developed and how electrified products are being priced. It could even go down to raw materials and how power purchasing agreements are being negotiated. So all of that is actually quite a complex situation. And in ASEAN, where it's quite different with economic makeups being different, developmental priorities being different, we also need to consider that a just and inclusive solution needs to be brought about.
Is there demand, Eric?
Yes, Haslinda. In fact, in the markets where we're focused on, which is Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, these markets are growing at high single digit per annum. Vietnam is at the high end of that, about 8-9%, and Philippines and Indonesia is in the 6 to 7% demand growth for electricity, and it's expected to accelerate.
But this is from a very low base.
Yes,
right?
from a very low base. It's expected to accelerate as more industrialization kicks in and more electrification, like what Horace is doing. And all the EV ecosystem will actually result in more demand. On the other hand, supply is limited, whereas before, in the last decade, coal plants are relatively easy and straightforward to build. It was very affordable and financeable. Now it's no longer the case. Countries like Philippines and Indonesia have moratorium on coal. And in the case of Vietnam, it's very hard to finance a coal plant. So this is an opportunity. We see a silver lining in terms of renewables to be scaled up in these markets. The demand is there. But the holy grail is to get energy storage scalable and competitive. And we're not there yet, unfortunately.
Up next, policy and practicalities, public and private, what governments need to be doing better, and the role of big data. This is Bloomberg New Directions. At its core, ASEAN is a loose alliance of 10 countries where policy, governance, and economic clout are as diverse as its people. So coming together for a common cause can be a major challenge. An ASEAN-wide power grid presents problems of risk, and collecting data is difficult. So we agree that access to data is critical, and it is the government that has the most data.
Yes.
My question really is, how can the private and the public sector work hand in hand to ensure that you capitalize on that data?
I think a lot of it, Haslinda, is also dependent on government policy and the market structure, the market framework. In the Philippines and Singapore, that's quite possible because the electricity market in these countries are already in the open and competitive market framework, just like Australia, UK, US, and the advanced markets. But in markets like Vietnam and Indonesia, it's still in the big monolithic government company, a corporation doing the buying and selling of power. So the consumer doesn't have a choice yet. They are captive to their utility or service provider. So I think policy needs to shift more on an open market framework to give the customer the power of choice to really maximize and leverage the data that we're talking about.
The ability to have actually our station 5G connected, have our station connected to the grid and have computers and servers actually, to Eric's point, look at the data and say, predictably, when are people going to use power? Tomorrow. And at this moment, what's going to happen? And then they say, I have available X amount of megawatt that I can actually give back, is something that will help the world transition in a more stable way.
I just want to bring up what the IEA said. It said that Southeast Asia, if the policies remain intact as they are now, it is very unlikely that the region will meet its net zero target. So which particular policies need to change?
What we saw in an IEA report is between 2016 and 2020, Southeast Asia saw about 70 billion on average annual energy investments. In order to reach our climate ambitions, Southeast Asia needs that number to go up to 200 billion by 2030. And I think one of the biggest ways we can do that is making our products or our investment structures as similar or as close to internationally recognized frameworks as possible. The second thing is accessibility, because investors like investment opportunities which are low risk, high return, and if we have investment opportunities which meet this criteria, it's always a good start.
Is it possible to be low risk when it's so uncertain?
Very hard, Haslinda. But on the policy point, I think it differs by market. And I think each market has gone on its own pace. In the last 3 to 4 years, Vietnam has led, it was the darling of the renewable sector.
Especially in the area of solar.
Yeah, solar and wind. Together, they built almost 20 gigawatts, 20,000 megawatts in just 4 years, surpassing any expectation. Thailand just completed 5 gigawatts of worth of solar and wind as well, but this is up to 2030, so it's a longer time frame. And the Philippines is now having its second or third round of feed-in tariff, and the Department of Energy just announced 11,000 megawatts of auctions for solar and wind and other technologies in the next 3 years. So it's exciting. In the Philippines, talking about policy shifts, the government also confirmed that renewables is open for business to foreign investors for 100%. It used to be limited to 40%, so that's great news for foreign investors, to our competitors. But that's fine. We have a lot to build in the Philippines, and the locals are arguably not enough to really scale up our renewables.
Eric's and your guys were talking about, low risk, high yield, and policy, and how that can balance each other. And I'll bring it back to kind of a little bit of what we did and why we chose Philippines as one of the first Asian countries to really launch. For example, there's a lot of usually discussions and subsidies that are involved or waiver of duty involved when something is brand new, and you have to actually take that risk and build that. And so certain condition needs to be in place, and certain policy needs to be in place in order to actually kind of kick that thing forward.
There are also incentives in Indonesia for fossil fuel, and therein lies the two forces.
Yeah.
We know that coal-fired power plants are the business as usual scenario within ASEAN if nothing's being changed. We've got 40% of coal-fired power plants under the age of 8 years old. We've got 90% which are under the age of 35. And as Eric mentioned, they can go up to 50 years old or more if they're well maintained. So trying to bring all these coal-fired power plants into early retirement and bringing up the clean power energy sector faster is very pertinent. Another mechanism that has really tried to systemically change the energy supply of a country is called the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or the JETP in short. And if we look at the Indonesian JETP, it's right now got public sector and private sector support, 10 billion from each side over the next 3 to 4 years. And with the private sector being coordinated by the GFANZ, which is the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So a lot of this will hopefully translate into real opportunities of converting coal-fired power plants repurposed into clean power.
We talk about the potential. Where are the real opportunities? Bearing in mind that this is a region that's really rich in the materials that are useful or needed in renewables.
Well, Indonesia, I think everyone knows already that it's rich in these raw materials, and the government have asked the industry to do the higher value add processing in country. And I think it's a great move, and that would have its own life and build the value chain and keep the high value add economic value in Indonesia. And ASEAN also benefits because of the free trade agreement. So that's certainly one thing, one center of gravity that we should be looking at in terms of sharing our resources. I think The other one is that's close to, we're in Singapore now, so it's close to Singapore's heart, is, Singapore does lack the natural resources, land among others, and the sun and the wind. So I think Singapore would depend on the ASEAN or its neighbors, or even the global system, to bring in, to help them realize their net zero commitments. And I think this is where the ASEAN grid comes into play. On the one hand, although that could be tricky in terms of policy, again, transmission we're talking about, it's not easy, and overlay government policy and so forth. There are some countries that have prohibited the export of those renewable energy or green attributes because each one will look after its own commitment first. So the other track that Singapore is looking at is the import of green molecules. And this is where it opens up a whole lot of opportunity in green hydrogen, green ammonia. So all that a very interesting space. We're all interconnected here. We just have to overcome one obstacle after the other, but there's a silver lining to all this.
When it comes to transportation, motorcycles are the heartbeat of ASEAN. We'll look at their role in the energy transition next. This is Bloomberg New Directions. There are more than 200 million motorcycles in Southeast Asia. And here in Thailand, known as the Detroit of the East, the automotive industry is big business. Car parts and assembly account for about 10% of GDP, but the electrification ecosystem across ASEAN lacks investment and infrastructure. I want to touch on electrification of vehicles because the picture in Southeast Asia is very different. 80% of the vehicles here are 2- and 3-wheelers, unlike the US, unlike China, unlike Europe. How do you see that transition? How different would that be?
If you look at the vehicle landscape in the old world, it's like a pyramid. Right? What people talk about in 4-wheel vehicle today, the Tesla, the Lucid, the Porsche, the Audi, is really tip of the iceberg, right on top. Then there's a whole bunch of people riding on the 2-wheelers on the bottom. And then there's a middle one, which is affordable 4-wheelers. I think that the space is only being talked about right here, like this. But as you transition the 2-wheelers on the bottom, it's actually much easier. So the energy efficiency, I always tell my friends and my business partners, powering a 4-wheel is difficult. You have to carry a sofa. You have to carry the windshield. You have to carry your air conditioner. Yeah, almost. You almost have the kitchen sink with you, right? Everything with you just to go to the grocery store. 2-wheeler is different. There is nothing on it. It's very, very lightweight. The efficiency on that is tremendously higher. I mean, we're talking about 5 times more efficient per kilometer on energy, right? Now, that becomes transition easier.
So in terms of technology that is exciting you the most, Eric, what would that be?
Well, in our industry, I think our core is really the different applications of solar and wind. So I think offshore wind has to happen in our part of the world. There's just limitations in terms of land. So we got to touch technologies that make use of the water surface, floating solar. Again, there's technology in terms of the floaters. It may seem very basic, but there's a lot of investment and R&D that's required to make it more cost efficient and so forth. I think energy storage, again, as I said, that's the holy grail because we can only scale up renewables so much without really getting storage right. And then, of course, green hydrogen is something that's happening very quickly than we expected. I would have thought this is a decade away, but a lot of companies are already doing some pilots. The IRA in the US really was a game changer in terms of enabling the green hydrogen industry. So I think that's going to happen as well. So we have to watch that space carefully, but it gives us the impetus to really build large scale.
10, 20 years down the road, how do you see the energy mix in Southeast Asia?
In Southeast Asia, I think my crystal ball says that we will still most likely have some fossil fuel, but hopefully the new build, when you alluded to a 40% investment by renewable share of investment today, I think that's normal. That's going to creep up to 100% over time, but it will be a couple of decades. And again, it depends on when energy storage will scale up, and these constraints on transmission, land, and so forth are unblocked. But until then, I think there will still be investments in hopefully natural gas as opposed to coal. I think coal investments is a thing of the past. I think in the near term, I still see gas investments happening, but increasingly renewables and storage will really take over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Idris, energy mix, how do you see that playing out 10, 20 years down the road?
I think if we're able to finance it correctly and efficiently, we will still be seeing some fossil fuel. I think if we look at all the different scenarios that have been planned out in terms of different transition pathways, fossil fuels still do feature a little bit. And I think it's very important that we have to recognize that ASEAN has its developmental goals. It needs to also be able to sustain an economy and allow its people to have affordable energy sources. So I think it will be lower. I hope it will be lower than what we have right now.
And how are you looking at EVs and electrifying vehicles 10, 20 years down the road? What kind of ratio are you looking at?
The great thing about a two-wheel vehicle is that the lifespan is shorter than a four-wheel vehicle. So on average, about 8 to 10 years, right? Whereas a four-wheel vehicle, you're talking about 20 years. So the churn is a lot faster. And I think that with the right policy in place, you're talking 20 years, I'd say easily over 50% of the vehicle on the road will be electric when it comes to two-wheelers.
What gives you the most hope when it comes to that energy transition in Southeast Asia? And what's the biggest challenge the region will face? Eric?
I think, first of all, most governments have already committed to net zero 2050, and I think Philippines will get there as well. It's got bold goals as well in 2030. So I think the commitment is there. The public pronouncements is important. It's a forcing mechanism to really create these specific policies that will enable that. And of course, technology, we never underestimate the power of technology. And I'm hoping that while the task seems daunting now, we've seen this in cell phones in the past. Who would have known that cell phones would be more than 100% penetration? Back in the day, the forecast was like 25% because it's expensive. So never underestimate technology. We could get to 100% net zero, but a lot depends on that human ingenuity and really scaling technology.
Whether it's energy transition, energy security, or trying to address climate change, we're really trying to solve a crisis for humanity. When we talk about the life cycle of whether it's a renewable power generator or electrified product, the use phase is what we've mainly been talking about today. And we know that the emissions reduction from all these new technology and the new economy and the new world will bring about a huge reduction in emissions. However, I think the sourcing of commodities, as well as where the products will go at the end of the day, those are very important considerations that any producer would need to also consider. And I think we need to be sensitive to also protect ASEAN as our home and not allow ASEAN to be a space for waste.
I think that with the global crisis, with pollution, traffic congestion, we're living amongst the biggest extinction this world has ever seen, the most fastest extinction. We either solve it now or we're never going to solve it.